Welcome everyone. My name is Blair Forlaw and I'm delighted to see you all here for the first in a series of programs that the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum is going to present this fall. We have entitled our series Religious Resolve, Stories from Our Past for Our Future, and we'd like to thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for making this series possible. Today, we're going to lift up and honor the courageous voices of Reverends Richard Allen and Absalom Jones during the American pandemic of 1793. This is a story from our past with lots of interesting and important lessons for our future. The formal part of our program is going to last for 1 hour. But our presenters have agreed to stick around for an extra 15 or 20 minutes. For anyone who has questions or comments that you'd like to make, we look forward to interacting with you after that hour is up. The chat function is open now. We invite you to key in your questions or comments or introduce yourself in the chat function at any time, and we will respond to those things at the end of the program. We're going to leave everyone's microphone on mute, and we're also going to keep your cameras off for the duration of the first hour of the program so that we can stay focused on the important and inspiring material that our presenters have to share with us today. Our moderator this afternoon is Rabbi David Spinrad, who is Rabbi at Beth Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria, Virginia, and he is also co-chair of Alexandria's Equal Justice Initiative Community Remembrance Project. I like to give special appreciation to Rabbi Spinrad because, as you know, the High Holy Days are coming up right upon us, and I'm sure he had plenty of other things that he could be attending to this afternoon. So we thank you especially. David, thank you, and I'm going to turn the program over to you now.
Thank you so much, Blair. It's an honor and it's a privilege. And yes, absolutely, the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah begins next Friday night at sundown. And one of the main themes of Rosh Hashanah is to take a step back and to refocus our lives and to experience a sense of renewal. So I actually think this is a beautifully timed opportunity, and I'm deeply honored to participate. And in the stepping back with this incredible program and our teachers before us, to step back and to remind myself that African American history is American history, and I'm really looking forward to learning from both of our teachers today. So if I may, nobody came here to listen to me, so I'm going to introduce our teachers and get out of the way. Kimberly Young is a citizen historian and a faith leader here in Alexandria, Virginia. Her professional background is a diverse one. Having studied performance formally, she's rooted in theater for social change and worked as a trainer and an advocate focusing on cross-cultural understanding and violence prevention throughout early adulthood. She was a human resources professional for nearly 20 years and has now transitioned into lay ministry. Kimberly is currently the Director of Church and Community Engagement at Washington Street United Methodist Church in Alexandria. She is the lay leader at Roberts United Methodist Church, the oldest Black Methodist church in Virginia and the oldest Black church structure here in Alexandria. Its cornerstone dates all the way back to 1832. A lover of church history, Kimberly is a niece of the late Reverend Dr. Carl Dunbar Ogden, former senior presiding elder of West Mainline District, Philadelphia Conference. This is part of the first Episcopal district of the AME Church, where Mother Bethel still thrives. The Reverend Lauren Harris is a native of Silver Spring, Maryland. Reverend Harris is a writer, editor, organizer, public speaker, and preacher. Her works have appeared in periodicals, including Gospel Today, Sojourners, Modern Loss, Women in Theology, the AME Church's Christian Recorder, Reed Temple AME Church's Joshua's Journal, Soli Deo Gloria Sisterhood, and many more. She produced for the nationally syndicated radio show Interfaith Voices. She launched the annual Hip Hop Summit for Southeast DC Partners, now the DC Dream Center. Reverend Harris has served a variety of ministries and churches in South Carolina and Maryland, and assisted the dean, faculty, and students at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Presently, she works with the Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church on leadership and congregational development. She is an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In honor of her late husband, Lauren volunteers as a speaker with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The proud mother of an 8-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, Lauren offers practical advice and encouragement to other parents in her blog, Throw Up and Theology, which reaches over 500 readers every month. Please be with me today. Enjoy this incredible program, and I look forward to the other side and a chance to ask our presenters some thoughtful questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. We thank you for joining us. We thank you for taking time out of your schedule, and certainly we thank the Freedom Forum and the RFC for thinking it not robbery to tell such an interesting history. I hope that you will sit back and join me on a rather informal journey. It has connections to today. We'll use words that you will be accustomed to hearing, that you may not have been accustomed to hearing 6 months, well, a year ago, as it may be. It was called the Yellow Fever, and it was the summer of 1793. It was a plague that struck America's nation's capital. This is the story of the Yellow Fever and the rise of the Black consciousness movement in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As I begin this presentation, I say this, that this study, this research is done in honor of my uncle, the late Reverend Dr. Carl Dunbar Ogden, and all the clergy of the AME Church, and the legacy of racial reconciliation amongst the Methodists in America. You'll notice from the map that we present that the plague hit in 1793, and it broke out along the wharf area of Philadelphia and spread slowly, or not so slowly, inland. It was the deadliest of outbreaks in American history to date. Nearly 5,000 inhabitants died by the end of the epidemic. It struck poorer communities more than wealthy communities. Why? Because wealthy communities had the ability to flee. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This map, if you look closely, reflects its intensity. We know that it was a warmer than usual summer. It was hot and it was humid. And it wasn't long before terror struck the entire city. It was in August of 1793 that the first fatality was noted. It was a man by the name of Peter Aston, and he became the topic of general conversation. People initially thought that this illness was a summer sickness until it was everywhere. Now, the yellow fever is a particularly disgusting illness. It's an illness that affects the liver, so you hemorrhage. There's vomiting, there's writhing and pain. People were prone to just die and be left in their homes. There was such a panic that when the illness hit inside of homes, people threw their children out of windows, left them in their yards. People fled. It was the prominent Dr. Benjamin Rush who first identified the yellow fever. And of course, we know that by the middle of August, it was just terror. Some believe that the disease was imported by the refugees fleeing the Toussaint Louverture revolution in Haiti. And the government took precautions that we're all too familiar with. There was a 2 to 3 week quarantine imposed by passengers and goods entering the harbor. But with government officials and people fleeing the city, they couldn't enforce those habits. There was also the issue of not understanding how the disease was spread. It was initially believed that it was spread from person to person contact. Nevertheless, by the middle of August, Philadelphia had become a city in terror. Now, we must first look at what Philadelphia was to America in 1793. It's a city of 55,000 inhabitants. It's diverse. We have German speaking and French speaking and a growing Black community, 3 Black inhabitants, not to mention those refugees coming from Haiti and fleeing slavery in the South. Philadelphia is home of the federal government, with many of America's most affluent citizens living there. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. It's in February that George Washington holds his first cabinet meeting. And March 4th, he's sworn in as for his second term. But there's something else happening in Philadelphia, in the nation even. In February of 1793, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 took away the legal rights of many free and escaping Blacks to fight legally for their freedom. As we move forward into this story, we find that it's not just the political city that is enhancing the struggle and the terror, but it's also the rise of political propaganda. We know that the slaves are fleeing the revolution in Haiti. We know that slaveholders are arriving with their slaves in the port. And we eventually come to learn that that is how the yellow fever reaches America. We later find out that it is spread by mosquitoes, but of course at this time, it's not sure. The Democratic Republicans are saying that it's unsanitary conditions coming from the docks. And so Benjamin Rush on the 27th of August issues an order and says that if you have the means to flee the city, flee, get out now, flee for your lives. This left Philadelphia in peril. Many doctors fled. The federal government relocated to Germantown, and the African-American community was left to bear the brunt. There's an emerging community of African-Americans in Philadelphia in the late 18th century. Philadelphia's free Black population was about 240 in 1780, and it exploded by 1790. Indeed, throughout the last half of the 18th century, we see doubling and tripling of the African-American population to the extent of increasing by about 2.1%. Many, of course, are fleeing through means of the Underground Railroad, and others are getting manumitted and remaining in Philadelphia. This brings us to the center of our drama, the center and to the voices of 2 courageous men. The Reverend Absalom Jones, who was born a slave in Delaware. We believe he was born around 1746, though the records are not very clear. He is the slave of the Wynkoop family. And keep that name in mind because it comes up a little later in the story. Jones relocates or is brought to Philadelphia after the plantation has been sold and his mother and 5 brothers are sold away. Jones is an intelligent young man, and he was immediately identified as being such by his owners and was taken in as a house slave. He was able to save money and bought a New Testament Bible. That is the document that he began learning to read with. In Philadelphia, he saved money and continued to want to learn and joined with the Quaker Anthony Benzett in his evening school. Jones was a man of particular courage and insight. He married a slave woman and he purchased her freedom before gaining his own. Why was that? Because he understood that if she was free, that any children of the Union would then be free. Jones was a forward thinker, a pragmatic man. And this is the energy with which he brings to our drama. He was finally freed in 1784, and in the late 1780s is an active member of the St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest Methodist church in America, there in Philadelphia. And it's there at St. George's that we believe the union between Richard Allen and Absalom Jones was formed. Richard Allen, similarly, was born a slave, Valentine's Day, 1760. The history tells us that he was the property of a man named Chew, Benjamin Chew. Records indicate that he moved with the Chew family to Delaware, but we know that there was a religious awakening during this time, that the evangelists and the circuit riding ministers would frequently stop by, and that he had a conversion. He eventually won his freedom and he began to preach and spent many years as an itinerant preacher. And we know that in the spring of 1787, while still working as a blacksmith, he too was a member of the St. George Methodist Episcopal Church. The Methodist Episcopal Church held great hope for many Blacks in Philadelphia. Why? Because there was at least the promise of some equality. The first minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church would later be the person whom the Free African Society brought to preach to them when they were establishing their own church. But in that year, in 1787, the minister of St. George Episcopal Church asked Allen if he would not lead a service for the African Americans of the community. A 5 a.m. service, if you would do that. And the preaching of Allen was such that the population grew, the membership and attendance in St. George amongst the Black population was exploding. And they needed more room. I imagine that the white population was exploding in membership as well. But the Blacks worked particularly hard to raise money, to support the church that had taken them in, that had given them some semblance of equality. Now, while all this is going on, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen and some others had begun to discuss the need for benevolence and benevolence organizations within the community. And so they were already meeting and praying and formulating some ideas about how they would move forward with not only their evangelism, but what was already becoming the principle of social justice. What was already part of the Methodist creed, which was making sure that we care for the lost, the least, and the left out. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones are already working this out, but they're working it out from the context of being members of the Methodist Episcopal Congregation of St. George's. Now, they've already founded the Free African Society, but while at St. George's and raising this money to expand the church so that it can meet the needs of the community, an interesting occurrence happens. Historians debate whether it was 1791 or 1792. Records indicate that there are receipts that say it may have been early 1792, whatever the case may be. Somewhere between the year of 1791 and 1792, this thriving Black congregation worshiped in tandem at times with the white congregation, and they had been moved apart to the sides of the church. Remembering that people bought pews if you had money for you to sit in your favorite pew, you bought it. The members, the Black members, were forced to the wall to sit in chairs. Well, one particular day, they came in and they were asked to move to the gallery, the balcony. Well, it doesn't seem that they mind so much. They went without alarm. But it was that they weren't sitting in the right seats in the balcony that they paid for. And so Richard Allen writes later that while Absalom Jones was on his knees praying, ushers from the church arrive and they seek to physically remove him from his prayer posture. They write that he grabbed by the back of the collar and forced to remove, and that they object and say, wait until the prayers are over. Well, this was exactly the impetus that the Free African Society needed. And Absalom Jones and Richard Allen on that fateful day walked the Black members out of that church. The Methodist Episcopal Church had failed in that day, and it failed to recognize the oneness of humanity. Now, the Free African Society, as I said, had been organized in 1787. It was organized initially as a benevolent society. The idea was that members would pay dues and that the Free African Society would care for the community. Remember that Philadelphia in and of itself had become a safe haven for Blacks fleeing oppression, that Pennsylvania had passed a law to slowly manumit slaves, so that there was a gradual freeing of slaves. So there was a thriving and growing free Black community as well as an enslaved Black community. And the Free African Society organized itself to help widows and poor. They convinced the city to allow them to buy the potter's field so that they would be able to bury the dying. The dues were used to care for the widows and to provide educational funds to the children left behind by those who had died. Already, Allen and Jones are laying the groundwork for what would become the liberation of a people, understanding that education is power. The Free African Society was organized very closely with the Quaker societies, remembering that there had been close association amongst the Quakers and the Black community. The Quakers had established schools, so it was understandable and foreseeable that the two organizations would work hand in hand. As the society began to more align itself with Quaker traditions, some feathers began to be a little bit ruffled, and Richard Allen eventually was read out of the Free African Society, but the Free African Society maintained its position and its prominence in the city. It is here in this backdrop of Philadelphia in 1793 that our drama takes off. The federal government is gone. The wealthy have fled, and people are dying everywhere. Nobody knows what to do. But the mayor and Dr. Benjamin Rush reach out to Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Now, Dr. Benjamin Rush is a very interesting character. He may remind you a little bit of Thomas Jefferson in his political leanings. He is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is a noted physician. He later becomes the Surgeon General of the Continental Armies, or was the Surgeon General of the Continental Army, and becomes the founder of American psychiatry. It's in 1793 that he reaches out to the Free African Society because he has been a contributor to the abolitionist movement and asks whether or not they are able to help. Now, there's one problem. He believes that Blacks are unable to contract yellow fever. No doubt it has to do with community and community spread. We know about contact tracing now, don't we? So he believes that they cannot contract the disease, and how wrong he was, because Allen himself eventually does get the yellow fever, although he recovers. He reaches out to his good friends and he asks them if it would please God that you would help us, that you would do something to reach out and serve mankind. It reads thusly: "It has pleased God to visit this city with a malignant and contagious fever, which infects white people of all ranks, but passes by persons of your color. I have therefore taken the liberty of suggesting to you, whether it's important exemption which God has granted to you from a dangerous and fatal disorder. Basically asking if you would, since you are able, come and help us again. It's an interesting thing because it talks again about how a dominant society views a marginalized society, how there is a misunderstanding of humanity. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones consider this and nonetheless agree. They realize politically that it's a good idea for them to engage in such an effort. After all, they're trying to improve the station of their people. They recognize that by doing this, they may gain some respectability, if you will. Both men already are well respected. Indeed, the mayor himself reaches out. In September 11th of 1793, the National Gazette publishes an advertisement that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen put forth, advertising for men and women to present themselves to the Free African Society. We can move to the next slide. To the Free African Society to serve as nurses and porters for the sick and the dying. September 11th, 1793. And so the Free African Society, having agreed to this effort, employing members of the Black community as porters, they drive wagons, they dig graves, some work as nurses, others are employed at the moment's notice. Jones and Allen explained at first, we made no charge, but we left it to those who were serving to demand what they would charge for their work. This went on for some time, but then it became an issue because as the hospitals were needing beds, Jones and Allen even went as far as to supply beds to the hospitals that were running out of beds. When hospitals were paying more than the African Society could afford, Allen and Jones petitioned the mayor, petitioned the people of the city to lower their wages for nurses so that there could be some relative equality, so that they would be able to find people, because indeed the sickness was such that there weren't even enough people to care for the sick and the dying. Yet the Black community endured. But as we know, no good deed ever goes unpunished, does it? Soon after Philadelphia's epidemic hit, accusations began to fly about the Black community. The Black community who had worked so hard to care for the sick and the dying, who had, many of whom who had become sick themselves while caring for families, children. Matthew Carey, who is an Irish-born American publisher of note. In fact, he was the first person we know of to call the land around the state capitol the Mall. He distributes a pamphlet around November of 1793 that accuses the Black community of profiteering from the disease and plundering houses. Now, Matthew Carey fled the city with most of the city's affluent rich, but yet he knew so much about what had happened in the city. No doubt there were diaries and stories, but what he did was of great consequence. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones immediately noted that though he held them in great esteem, he talked greatly about how good Allen and Jones and Gray were. They were noble men. He talked about the others who stole, pilfered. Not a good thing. Jones and Allen were forward-thinking men, and they understood that in this great new America, history would be written by the victors, and if there was not a written history, a written response and an account to what had happened, that this account that Carey gave would become the law of the land. And so in 1794, Richard and Absalom Jones come together for the narrative of the proceedings of the, we can go back to the previous slide, the narratives of the proceedings of the Black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year of 1793. This is a monumental work. And at this point, I'm going to encourage you, if you have not read it, get a copy and read it. This work becomes the foundation of Black liberationist theology. It becomes the foundation of the reclaiming of one's own personal narrative. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were meticulous note takers. And as they move through this narrative, they began to recount the monies that they received and the monies that they paid for burying the dead. They immediately attack Carey and take him to task for what he has done. They note that you cannot raise some up while putting others down. They immediately recognize and call him out for profiteering himself on this event, that he indeed probably made more money from scraps than they made in caring for the people stricken with the yellow fever. Indeed, as they move through the pamphlet, they give an actual financial accounting of the money that was taken in and the money that was spent, and they show how they didn't even break even. They go on to address the needless and senseless accusations of the people of the Black community by giving accounts of members of the white community, not to say, to point the finger, but to show that the misuse, the mistreatment of people can happen by anybody of any race. They give an account of one white woman who cared for a family, and they were called out to remove the body after the woman had died, and the white woman laid there on the floor drunk with the woman's ring on her finger and her jewels falling out of her pockets. They give several such accounts, and then they counter Carey's argument with individual accounts of people of color who acted remarkably. There was the man who, walking down the street, heard a man crying out from his window, "Sir, can somebody bring me some water?" Remembering that nobody wanted to go near anyone who was hemorrhaging from their eyes and vomiting. And this man says from the street, "Sir, I will get you this drink of water." And when he was pressed upon to receive money, he refused. There was the widow who was called upon to care for a sick family when no other nurses could be found. She left her home, she went and cared for this family and would not take one single dime. There was the man who went from family to family to family caring for the sick, who eventually contracted the disease and died himself. So we see by the end of this yellow fever that one, Dr. Rush was wrong. Blacks were susceptible and they died. But we also see not just the courageous voices of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, but the courage of a community that understood our interconnectedness and stayed the course and took care even when their own lives were in peril. Now, if one takes a closer look at the narrative, which lists all of the events that have happened during the summer of 1793, you come to 3 letters. Absalom Jones took the time to address, and Richard Allen took the time to address, white slaveholders that believed that slavery was correct, to the Black community and to those who had helped the Black community. 3 separate letters. It is in these letters that we really learn about what it is and what is becoming of this Black consciousness in America. 1794, the late 18th century, we immediately see these men beginning to not only reclaim their narrative, But they begin to speak about resistance in forms that scholars would write about years later. They address members of the Black community and begin to talk about what it means to be a slave. In their address to the communities of color, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones begin to speak about mental slavery, about rising above the oppression that they find themselves in, while cautioning them to behave right now. We don't want to upset anybody, but if you strive for freedom, we are here. There's an address in there as well to those who are free amongst the African American population. Why is that important? It's important because they begin to speak a narrative of behavior that allows them to code switch, if you will, to act in a way that the majority culture will find acceptable, as not to impede the progress of anyone else of your race. Even more astonishing is the letter to those slaveholders. In 1794, these two men dare to attack in writing the idea of inferiority. They suggest to the slaveholder to try an experiment. Now remember, we've got Benjamin Rush, who is no doubt an acquaintance of Thomas Jefferson, who has espoused the inferiority of the Black man. Allen says, try it. Take some of your slaves, those you see lower, and put them with your white children. Give them the same advantage, the same education, and watch and see if they do not rise, maybe higher than their fairer race. That's one. The second thing that arises in these letters, in this letter in particular, is the beginning of a Black liberationist theology. Allen and Jones immediately begin to impose the Moses narrative. What's unique about this? They are taking their God, the white man's God, and using that God to explain to them why oppression is wrong. They say to them, don't you understand that God is the first to oppose slavery, that it is God who opposes our oppression? What an idea, what an assertion for two men of color, formerly slaves, to make. Not only that, there's the challenge to not be found like Pharaoh, to not be insolent, to listen to the teachings which you espouse. And what becomes very interesting and colorful in this whole narrative is, while all of this is taking place, we have the development of the first African churches. What we realize is that in reclaiming the narrative, it is important to be able to theologically speak to a community inside their own language, to be able to care for them in a particular way. What becomes more prophetic is the fact that the minister that undertook, because Allen and Jones neither were ordained and allowed to perform the sacraments, is the first minister of St. George's Methodist Church, who is an Episcopal priest who was sent to America, ordained by John Wesley himself, for my good Methodists on the line. And he is the child of the master of Absalom Jones. How does God work these things out? That the man who was cared for by the man who would become the father of the African church is the man that would help, maybe stand beside them as they walked out into a new world, into a place where they could control their own narrative and their own destiny. It is a movement inside of an epidemic. It is a challenging time that requires us to grow, that requires these men to speak. And although theologically they went their separate ways, Absalom Jones in 1794 becomes the father of Black Episcopalianism as he starts the African Episcopal Church. Richard Allen, of course, goes on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But these two men don't leave each other's side. They remain amongst the intellectual elite and the workers of good in Philadelphia. And so as we progress through the years, we see Richard Allen and Absalom Jones working hand in hand to move the pendulum for Blacks in Philadelphia. We know that Bethel, Mother Bethel, as it is now called, becomes a station on the Underground Railroad. We know that it is Absalom Jones himself who helps to organize in 1817 the greatest movement. It was the Ferguson of 1793. When the American Colonization Society, that's a group that believed that we should move Blacks back to Africa, decided to meet in January of 1817, the Methodists and the Episcopals bring the leaders of the Black community together in Philadelphia, and they begin to have a discussion about this. Now, this is particularly important to this narrative because initially they give their consent. They say, yes, we think that this repatriation to the land of our home is a good thing. But no doubt, Absalom Jones, who is the more quiet and pragmatic leader, and Richard Allen, who has all of our fire and exposition, begin to talk. And by April, when the American Colonization Society comes back, the entire Black community of Philadelphia denounces the repatriation of Blacks to Africa. Why? Because they recognized that they were Americans and that America was their home, that they did not need to leave to exist, that America needed to recognize them, that they needed the strength of their people. This is an incredible time in the history of Black people in America. Indeed, it is an incredible place to learn what the religious movements of today still have yet to understand about inclusion. Richard Allen met his wife, Sarah Allen, while caring for the sick. Those who understand the Methodist Episcopal tradition know that there is a coexistence between the minister and his wife. I wonder if she nursed him while he was sick with yellow fever. We don't know. But what we do know is that in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, if the husband is the minister, then the wife is the president of the missionary society. So you see that not even is it African liberation, but it's gender equality. There is the beginning in this story of what God intended for man. And these two men dare to speak it out, dare to live it out. Throughout the remainder of the late 1700s and the 1800s, these men continue to work together. In 1816, Jones got to see his friend Allen consecrated as the first bishop of the newly formed AME Church. I imagine that he smiled because Richard Allen was there when he was finally ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. We are indebted to these men for their courage and for their legacy. Mother Bethel in Philadelphia still thrives. St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Philadelphia still thrives. These are the oldest African congregations in America. At the end of the pamphlet, there is a poem, though it is not attributed to any author. It would do us well to take heed and to listen to the words therein. Thinking about Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, ye ministers that are called to preaching, teachers and exhorters too, awake, behold your harvest wasting, arise, There is no rest for you to think upon the strict commandment that God has laid on his on his teachers laid. The sinner's blood who dies unwarned shall fall upon their shepherd's head. But, oh, dear brethren, let's be doing. Behold, the nation is in distress. The Lord of hosts forbid their ruin before the day of grace is past. We read of wars and great commotions before the great and dreadful day. My message to you, my friends, oh, sinners, turn your sinful course and trifle not your time away. Oh, dear sinners, that's not all. That's dreadful. You must before God appear to give an account of your transactions and how you spent your time when here. This is the legacy of not just courageous voices, but of prophetic voices, of voices that called a young America to stand and give account for its misusage of people because they look different, to prophetic voices that spoke truth to lies, to prophetic voices that stood strong and understood what the possibilities were for a free people. These are the final thoughts that we must give an account for how we transact our time. Do we build a community up? Do we fight for justice? Or do we run away because there's the potential for death? We will give an account of how we spend our time while we are here. Reverend Harris.
Amen. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for your passion and the hard work that you put into this presentation and highlighting the legacy of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. It was a mighty, powerful presentation, and we are grateful. My name is Reverend Lauren Harris, and I've been tasked with the opportunity to provide my reflections on this presentation. But before I get started, I just want to thank Blair Forlaw and Kimberly and the Freedom Forum for inviting me this afternoon. I also thank you, Rabbi Spinrad, for that introduction. Thank you so much. It is my honor and privilege to share my thoughts about this story and how it relates to what we're dealing with today in 2020. I have been a minister in the AME Church for 16 years, having served primarily in the Maryland area at Reed Temple AME Church in Glendale, Maryland, and I've also served in our 7th Episcopal District in Columbia, South Carolina for 2 years. So it's my pleasure and my privilege to represent the AME Church by participating in this conversation. And also, I just want to note that in my reflections, I use Black and African American interchangeably, so just to prevent any confusion. Yesterday, as I was scrolling through my Twitter feed, I saw a post from a Baptist minister. He was a white male, and he's the head of a Bible college, and he raised the question, why didn't God just say no slavery in the Bible? Why the extensive laws regarding it? And as I read through the comments mostly made by other white people, I became highly annoyed and agitated. Agitated because all throughout their responses, people were using the Bible to allude to some sort of justification for slavery. One respondent even said she didn't understand why most Americans become fixated on chattel slavery when this kind of question is presented. And as I read through the comments, I thought to myself, this is why I'm AME. This is why I belong to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. because like many Black people, I am tired of having to teach, convince, and persuade others who read the same sacred texts, call on the name of the same God, and have access to the same resources as me, that the enslavement and dehumanization of my ancestors and the continued dehumanization of Black people in the United States is unequivocally and undeniably unbiblical and unchristian. I believe that the fatigue that I feel today in the year 2020, when I have to assert my humanity and that of my children and people who look like me in the rally cry of Black Lives Matter, is similar, not the same, because we don't have to contend with enslavement, but similar to that of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen when they penned the pamphlet Narratives of the Proceedings of Black People during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures. The Bible says in Ecclesiastes 1:9 that there's nothing new under the sun. And I want today's participants to understand that the same anti-Blackness and stereotypes about Black people that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen had to contend with are the same ones that present-day African Americans have to combat. The first issue I want to address is the dehumanization and othering of Black people. Dr. Benjamin Rush concluded Black people could not catch yellow fever. He surmised that Black people were immune to the disease because of their race, because white physicians at the time believed that there were innate physiological differences in Black bodies. Rush was an abolitionist, but that didn't stop him from making inaccurate and harmful statements about Black bodies. In 1799, he published the essay, Observations Intended to Favor a Supposition that the Black Color of the Negroes is Leprosy, in which Rush concluded that physical characteristics commonly found in Black people are symptoms of leprosy. This dehumanization of Black people is what led to J. Marion Sims, 1813 through 1883, father of modern day gynecology, to perform all kinds of medical experimentation on enslaved women. The U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health reported in 2006 in their piece, The Medical Ethics of Dr. J. Marion Sims, a fresh look at the historical record, that Sims performed 30 operations on one enslaved woman named Anarcha before he was able to close holes in her bladder and her rectum. Sims did not use anesthesia on this woman or the other enslaved woman because he believed that they could not feel pain because of their race. We can't deny that these types of beliefs have not carried over into modern day medicine and ways of thinking. In the myth of innate racial differences between white and Black people's bodies, lessons from the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Dr. Raina Hogarth states, mentions of slavery and the shadow that its legacy has cast on medical, public health, and allied health professionals in the U.S. have crept into national discussions on racial disparities in health outcomes, treatments, and access to health care. This is clearly illustrated by the 2016 study on racial bias in pain assessment by Hoffman, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Some of the study's findings include widespread beliefs among white medical residents and lay people that Blacks have thicker skin than do white people, or that Black people's blood coagulates more quickly than a white person's blood. This is why we continue to see health disparities even today, including in Black maternal health, or even in today's response to COVID-19. Somebody say amen. On July the 22nd, 2020, the New England Journal of Medicine published Structural Racism Social Risk Factors in COVID-19, a Dangerous Convergence for Black Americans. The article states, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly illustrates the intersection of structural racism, social risk factors, and health. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on COVID-19 infection and mortality rates show higher incidences in specific geographic regions. It goes on to state it has been hypothesized that increased exposure to COVID-19 among Black Americans is attributable to greater representation in service occupations and a greater likelihood of living in inner cities with high population density. This is what we know to be systemic racism. The article states, the history of inner cities has left Black Americans with fewer economic and educational opportunities than their white counterparts and has exposed them to social risk associated with more severe negative effects. A lack of financial resources resulting from years of structural racism confers a host of social risks, including food insecurity, housing instability, and limited access to transportation. This is similar to what happened in Philadelphia, as we just learned, where we saw those who had the means and those white people fleeing Philadelphia and the Blacks who did not have those means being left to deal with the devastation of yellow fever. Again, this is attributed to slavery and systemic racism. When propositioned with caring for the sick and burying the dead, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen viewed it as an opportunity to help shift beliefs about Black people and help in their abolitionist efforts. But instead of advancing their causes and shifting beliefs about Black people, they were met with accusations of criminality. They were accused of overcharging people and looting the homes of the sick and capitalizing off the plague. Matthew Carey's accusations of Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and other African Americans do not shock or surprise me. The criminalization of Africans and Black people is nothing new. And I saw that someone posted in the chat room, there is nothing new under the sun. The belief that Africans were savages and needed to be civilized was one of the justifications for slavery. Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and the Black people who served as nurses and assistants to the sick and dying should have been deemed heroes. However, their practices were called into question. Black people still face these types of stereotypes and injustices today. I shared with my Twitter followers that last week my family and I visited a small beach in Kent County, Maryland. We were the only Black family there at the time. As soon as we pulled up and started setting up our spot, two white beachgoers who were in the water jumped out of the water and retrieved their belongings. And we don't know exactly why, because we're not mind readers, but we surmise that it's because we are Black. It's the same reason why when a Black man gets on elevators or walks by on the sidewalk, people clutch their purses. It's because of the persistent belief of the criminalization of Black people. In 1793, we had Black people witnessing the horrors of a plague and putting their lives on the line as acts of compassion and to be a credit to their race and prove their worthiness and morality for freedom's sake. But this couldn't shake the ingrained racist beliefs among those who profess themselves to be allies and brothers and sisters in the same faith. Again, there is nothing new under the sun. The criminalization of Black people continues today. It's why Black people are met with aggression and violence by the police, although unarmed and innocent. It's why Black students are dealt with more harshly than their white counterparts in school systems, hence the preschool to prison pipeline. In their article, From Brute to Thug, the demonization and criminalization of unarmed Black male victims in America, Calvin John Smiley and David Bonkunelli state, media portrayals of this mythical Black brute began to grow using the same initial science Jefferson and other Enlightenment era theorists proclaimed, which was based on inaccurate anthropological and biological factors. This time, the argument was that Blacks were naturally more prone to violence and other aggressive behaviors. Charles H. Smith wrote in 1893, "A bad Negro is the most horrible creature upon the earth, the most brutal and merciless." This myth of cruelty and vicious disposition was directed towards white women. As the myth grew and stories spread about the savage Black brute, so did the occurrences of lynching. We see the same type of demonization and dehumanization today in the depictions of protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. The media and the masses use terms like thugs and animals to describe protesters and victims of police violence. That's why Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's narrative inspires me, and it's one of the reasons why I'm proud to carry the baton of fighting against systemic racism and injustice as an African Methodist Episcopal minister. I'm inspired to continually lift up my voice because my denominational forefathers boldly declared their humanity and reclaimed their narrative. Now, I have deep roots in the AME tradition. Here I have with me my grandfather's 1976 AME Doctrine and Discipline and hymnal. They belong to my paternal grandfather, the Reverend Richard Roland Blackstone, an AME pastor from Trenton, New Jersey. It's because of this legacy that I continue to lift up my voice and reclaim my narrative. So what does this story mean for us today? First, this story should serve as a wake-up call that although we made progress in the US when it comes to racism and race relations, we still have a long way to go. Because the beliefs that led Matthew Carey to accuse Black people of stealing during the plague in Philadelphia are still prevalent today. We need to acknowledge those beliefs and work toward healing and reconciliation and justice. Second, it's time to listen to those people who are on the margins of society, specifically Black people and other people who are oppressed. We don't like to use the word oppression in our society today, but oppression does happen in the United States. We would not see the disparities in incarceration rates, arrests and police brutality rates, health disparities, and economic disparities if oppression and systemic racism did not exist. And lastly, this story should reaffirm to us, especially those of us who are minorities in this country, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community, how important it is to reclaim your narrative and to tell your story. This story should reaffirm to us how powerful our voices really are, and that we should never let anything or anyone silence us. I think we fail to realize how dangerous it was for Absalom Jones and Richard Allen to speak out against Matthew Carey's accusations. However, they didn't let fear and intimidation stop them. And I pray that we follow their example and seek justice and equality and reclaim our narratives by any means necessary. Thank you.
Reverend Harris, Kimberly Young, wow. For the courage of Reverends Allen and Jones, and for the incredible wisdom and scholarship that you bring to their stories then and to our times now. Thank you. And I'd like us all just for a moment to honor them with a moment of silence. Amen. We have time for some informal questions. If Reverend Harris and Kimberly Young, if you're up for it, there are some questions in the chat box if you'd like to address them. Would you like me to read them out, or would you prefer?
I can't see the questions in the chat box.
I see several actually, and Lauren, you can, this one you can jump with me on.
Okay.
Alan, and okay, I lost it. There it is. When discussing, okay, there it went again. When discussing Sarah Allen, what was the organization women became organizers and heads of as their husbands were ministers? So the missionary societies in the AME churches traditionally, the pastor is the pastor, the wife then becomes the president of the missionary society. And I think on the line, I see Mrs. Farstein Ogden, who was her husband's able president of the Missionary Society of Philadelphia's First District for years. Lauren, do you want to add some good AME wisdom to that?
Well, I just want to say that it is our tradition that your spouse is your partner in ministry, that they very much view ministry as a partnership between married couples.
And so in that, this idea, it's a very Methodist underpinning mission, and caring for the community. And so certainly within the AME church, as within all, I would think all churches, but it's very strong in the Methodist tradition, that social justice arm. And so as the congregations and then the larger conferences, districts and then conferences endeavor, then you see this tandem ministry. There was a question in there. I'm going to see if I can touch it briefly. And I will admit that I don't have the most scholarly information. I'm going to talk from the top of my head about the Convention of 1830. It's interesting because they call it that first convention of Blacks. It was the first organized one, and it was sparked by a few events. I just want to bring to your attention as I speak about that Colored Convention of 1830 that happened at Mother Bethel. I think it was the fall of 1830. Some important stuff. First, let's remember what happened in 1817. Like, it's critically important to remember that the free peoples were gathered in 1817 to really stand against the American Colonization Organization. One. Two, there's a lot of scholarly debate, if I remember correctly, about the 1830 convention. It was the start of many conventions, but there's a lot of debate as to what came out of that. Indeed, Richard Allen did not attend, if I remember, meetings after the 1831. There was one that occurred in 1831. I think it went through 37, if I'm not mistaken. And again, I'm going off the top of my head, so please consult a source. But the idea was to address what was happening in America in general. We had what was happening in Ohio and the threat to the Black populations in Ohio. We had David Walker's appeal going around. There have been riots in 1829. And so delegates came, I think there were about 40 of them from the states together in Philadelphia, free people, to discuss what would happen. But I think the most significant part of this is recognize that these are all the forerunners of organizations like the NAACP. And so as these men are gathering, and we know that it was mostly men then, understand that that becomes the real emphasis of those conventions. I hope that I did that some justice, and I'm happy to send resources on. Has the Methodist Church ever apologized? Oh, this is my favorite subject, Karen Johnson. Ever apologized for its treatment of the ministers? I think we have to ask first whether or not the treatment has changed amongst the people. This is a very interesting thing, and I'm not going to take up too much time, but there's a couple of things that become very important. One, that Allen and Jones had actually petitioned St. George's for a couple of years to establish a free church, and the ministerial staff of St. George's had denied them the opportunity, refusing to recognize them as an organization. One. Two, as the Methodist Church was going through its own division and feelings about slavery, the Methodist Church in and of itself tried to reincorporate the AME Church back into the Methodist Episcopal Church. And I think it was Bishop Campbell who initially sent a representative to one of the New Orleans conventions that basically said that if you're not willing to see our ministers on par with white ministers, that is to say that of the same training and education, if you aren't willing to allow them to be ministers of white congregations, as well as Black congregations, we have no interest in being a part of you. So while there has been, I think, an acknowledgement in Methodist history of the mistreatment of Richard Allen, I think it's indeed an embarrassment to the Methodist Church, but there has been an acknowledgement of it. I think we see the vestiges of the disparity, the inequality in leadership, even present in today's denomination. Forgive me, all United Methodists. I am a United Methodist. Okay, I love us.
I can jump in on a couple of the questions that were raised here. Yes, we have recorded this session, and I will send everyone an email when it is up. There's a little conversion and editing that needs to take place when we get it up on the Freedom Forum's YouTube channel. I will send you an email. Also, we have 4 additional programs scheduled in this series. It's going to be hard to top what we heard today. In fact, it's really going to be hard, but we do have some interesting topics. The next 3 sessions are on Thursdays at 1 o'clock. The first one on September 24th will be the story of 2 little known and in fact practically unknown African-American suffragists whose lives are just fascinating and who tell us not only about their own religious resolve, but the times they lived in. That's on September 24th. On October 1st, we're going to hear the story of Onesimus and Reverend Cotton Mather. This one in Boston in 1721, a very important story that takes us back to another epidemic, this one smallpox. And again, there are issues of race, religion, conflict, resistance that are interesting to hear. On October 8th, we're going to hear about the struggle for the vote and how it continued, particularly within the African American community after the 15th Amendment was passed and the 19th Amendment was also ratified. And then our next Sunday afternoon program will be on October 11th, a fascinating program about the Grimkeys, in which we will talk about Reverend Francis Grimke, who is pastor here at 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the amazing work that he did, as well as his half-sisters, 2 Quaker sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were abolitionists. So don't worry, if you registered for this event, we know how to stay in touch with you, and we'll let you know about these other events as they come up. So Rabbi Spinrad, I think we've come to the end of our time. If you want to, do you have a closing comment? If you want to dismiss us and thank everyone, thank you so much, and thank our presenters for this powerful, powerful program.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Blair. Thank you to our teachers, to Kimberly, to Reverend Harris. Thank you to everybody who participated today, and most of all, thank you to the Holy One, blessed be, who allowed us to come together in peace as sisters and brothers, united in our pursuit of justice as we came together this afternoon in peace. So we may depart as well in peace. We say, Boachem leshalom, go in peace, Tzetchem leshalom, return to your lives in peace. Amen.